What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, so continuing our catch-up videos with DC Rebirth, we switch over to Unstoppable from Aquaman. And this is actually a really cool story. I'll be honest with you guys, for all the Aquaman fans, like, Rebirth is winning me over. It's funny because I covered Aquaman Rebirth, The Deluge, I think it was, the first story arc, and then I hadn't covered it since and hadn't really read it too much since. But like getting back into this, man, it's winning me over hardcore. Like it's really good. And that's what everybody's been telling me. They're like, dude, Aquaman in DC Rebirth is exceedingly good. So the cool thing about this is that this picks up with a couple different things. Remember, when it came to the New 52, where previously Mera was always kind of believed to be the wife of Aquaman, when DC rebooted, they basically brought her from Zebulon, so that she was originally an assassin tasked with killing Aquaman and then basically fell in love, and the two had kind of been together ever since. The result is that she's not really highborn of Atlantis. She's highborn of Zebul, meaning that she's of royal blood, but because she doesn't hail from Atlantis, she's not really attuned to Atlantis's customs, things like that. Now, this was one of the common traits that was shared between Mera and Arthur Curry, in the sense that Arthur Curry was born, you know, in like Amnesty Bay, and he spent a bulk of his life on the surface. So he was never really raised with the traditions and the beliefs of Atlantis. The difference here is that in a lot of ways, he gets a pass because he's the rightful king. And so it's just kind of like, it's whatever I want to do. And while a lot of people do it grudgingly, at the end of the day, they don't really have the authority to overrule the king. And not many members of Atlantis are going to go with them. Now, that's really where groups like the Deluge kind of step in, where it's just kind of like, okay, look, we are not a fan of Aquaman being king and we want to bring him down. So that kind of brings the other half of that fold into the equation. But for Mera, because of the fact that she's basically the girlfriend of Arthur Curry at the moment in terms of actually being his wife, they're not really married yet, she does not have the same kind of rights or authority Arthur Curry has. And so the result is that we basically have these more or less like widow women is really what they are. They're basically widows of either husbands or they're the mothers of sons who have died in battle, but they are some of the longest standing members of Atlantis, because there's kind of a tradition here in the sense that when a soldier gives their life for Atlantis, it's like the highest honor they could achieve. They understand the true nature of what it means to sacrifice to Atlantis, and in turn, they gain a higher bit of reasoning. So they're more like priestesses or kind of like female versions of monks than anything else. But the idea behind this is because of the fact that they're mothers and their wives and things like that, they really begin to kind of bring Mera in for the purpose of going through the ritual trials. And what these are designed to do is basically demonstrate that she is capable of being a queen to Aquaman. Now, in truth, in terms of like what's going on in the story, the role she's played, this is really more of just like a circumstance than anything else. I mean, in all honesty, it's not really a requirement, just because of the fact that she knows what it means to be highborn, meaning she knows what it means to be of royal blood and the responsibilities that come along with it. And because of the various struggles that she's faced alongside Arthur Curry, she's as much suited to be a queen as anybody else, if not better suited. And so she's really kind of going through the paces because this group has the ability to block the marriage from happening. And so it's more or less like, fine, I'll do it, not because I want to, but because I have to. Now, the other half of this comes in the form of Black Manta. Again, Black Manta, being one of the most notable villains of Aquaman, had basically taken over a group called Nemo, which existed for the purpose of controlling the various, aquatic resources of the world and kind of controlling things behind the scenes. But because of the fact that his vendetta against Aquaman is really like the first and foremost thing he goes for, what they ended up doing was just kind of releasing this incredible being that just kind of shows up to attack Atlantis. Now, of course, as we get into this, the funny thing about this is, notice, this being is virtually unstoppable, hence the name of the story. There's really nothing they can do. I mean, we have the Drift, which are basically like the Black Ops team of Atlantis. And I just want to say, that's such an awesome name. Like, it's such an awesome name to call yourself the Drift. Like, we're just like, we're the highest, like, we're the elite warriors of Atlantis, and we're called the Drift. That's such a cool name. I love that name. It's just such a cool name to have. But the funny thing is, when they try to take it out, they knock it down occasionally, but it always gets back up. It always keeps making a return. Not only that, it keeps healing itself. Now, of course, Aquaman, being the most formidable fighter of Atlantis, really isn't able to do anything on his own. So the kind of question you have to ask here is, how in the world could they win? Now, of course, again, jumping back to Mera, this is probably one of the more interesting aspects of the story. In truth, the whole conflict with Aquaman is pretty straightforward. I mean, it'll develop, some meat and potatoes of its own as the story goes on. But if really in the moment, it's really more about Mera than anything else. Because one of the things to keep in mind is that in terms of the publication history of her character, she's always been headstrong. That really goes into like the evolution of comics in a lot of different ways. And again, to kind of sidetrack from the story for a second, you can trace the evolution of society alongside alongside the evolution of comics, because comics are designed to mirror society. And so when you look at like women in comics, for example, while, Lois Lane was kind of like, yeah, I'm headstrong and I'm a bit fiery, at the end of the day, she was the damsel in distress. Well, Superman will save her. Superman will always save Lois Lane. As the years progressed, that began to change. And that's why when you get into Lois Lane, really in like the 1980s, 1990s, even in the 70s and somewhat the 60s, a lot of fans love Lois Lane. They absolutely love the character of Lois Lane because she's headstrong, she can stand on her own 2 feet. I mean, she's easily someone who can handle her own. Now, of course, even if only for the sake of storytelling, Superman will show up from time to time in order to help her out. But a lot of times it's one of those things like, I don't need your help and I don't want your help. And fans love that because it shows independence and all that kind of cool stuff. And it really gives a lot of female readers someone to idolize. And so the result of this is that Mira was kind of brought in this era where comics were starting to transition to the idea of women kind of stepping into their own in the comic book landscape and becoming more significant characters. And so the result is that with Mira's character, as she exists in the here and now, she's very much a reflection of how she was before DC rebooted in the New 52, in the sense that she's not someone you want to trifle with, that she's not someone you want to mess with. She's pretty headstrong and pretty fiery. And that really shows itself in her love for Aquaman. Of course, it's basically this idea that she sees the trials as nonsense. She's like, look, you cannot instill in me anything I don't already have. I'm already a warrior because I was trained to be an assassin. I love Arthur Curry because he's the man that I'm going to marry. We've been through so many things. You guys don't even really understand how deep the relationship goes between the two of us. It's interesting because it's basically people she doesn't know anything about, who don't really know anything about her outside of where she comes from, who's never been alongside her and Arthur Curry when they've gone on their various adventures, and when, Arthur Curry fought Superman and different things like that. They weren't there for any of that. Yet somehow they're in a position to where they can determine whether or not she's allowed to be married. You guys see where she's coming from. They don't know anything about her, yet they're going to decide whether she gets married or not. It's a huge pill to swallow, and that's why it works. But again, getting into the whole situation with Aquaman, the funny thing about this is that once we get into this in terms of them facing off against this foe, what we end up finding out, the monster they're facing off against is actually Shaggy Man. Now, Shaggy Man is cool. The Shaggy Man is an absolute, he's a beast. Shaggy Man appeared back in 1966 with Justice League of America issue number 45. And the whole idea behind Shaggy Man is that he's kind of like Doomsday before Doomsday, in the sense that he heals and he adapts to whatever it was that injured him in the first place. And that's the cool thing, is because he's always been this absolute, almost unstoppable force when it comes to the Justice League, in the sense that he can't really be defeated through conventional means, which is to say beating him up or shooting him with heat vision or something along those lines. Now, really, when it comes to like Shaggy Man, when the Shaggy Man comes hunting for you, it's going to be almost impossible to take him out. And so the result is that Aquaman really kind of makes this case, look, we can't take this guy out through conventional means. Not only that, we end up finding out the destination of the Shaggy Man is Amnesty Bay. And again, this is part of the whole intention of Black Manta. And this is what I want to talk about for a second. One of the reasons why a lot of Aquaman fans really enjoy the villain Black Manta is because he's not really your typical villain. He's much like Lex Luthor in the sense that it's not just a physical battle. Black Manta doesn't really have like superpowers like Aquaman, but he does have like enhanced combat ability, different things like that. But it's a war on multiple fronts. Break Aquaman psychologically, break him mentally, break him down to the point that like he loses the will to fight or something along those lines. That's why attacking Amnesty Bay is so important, because that's the home of Aquaman. Aquaman's true home is not Atlantis. Attack Aquaman's true home so he can never really go back. He can never really go back to his home again, and he loses that part of himself. That's why it works, and that's why it's intriguing, because where they're kind of chasing after the Shaggy Man, and where the scenario becomes the Shaggy Man's going after Amnesty Bay, then now it's not just a matter of Amnesty Bay being attacked, it's the areas around Amnesty Bay. Now remember, this is important because relationships between the surface world and Atlantis are tenuous enough as it is. And so where Aquaman is in the midst of trying to like stem this tide and trying to, neutralize the struggles between the surface and the Atlantean society, if a being like Shaggy Man just kind of explodes from the seas and then just starts attacking Amnesty Bay, and the government hears about it, the government's going to think Atlantis is attacking us again. They're going to consider it a first strike, and all-out war is going to take place. But the whole idea here is that with the Shaggy Man showing up, it does kind of highlight the idea that there are people who still don't like Aquaman. They still kind of consider him to be more of a nuisance than anything else. The other half of this is Aquaman's pride. Under normal circumstances, he would call in the Justice League, and that's what one of his guys say. Why don't you call in the Justice League? Now, this is something I want to talk about for a second. This is a big deal because this is a question a lot of people ask. There's a lot of different scenarios and circumstances that exist out there in comic books where you're reading about this battle where a superhero's fighting with every ounce of strength they have, and it seems like they can't win. And the question becomes, well, why don't they call in the Justice League? Or why don't they call in the Avengers? Or why don't they call in the other X-Men or something along those lines? Well, in truth, one part of that is just for the sake of storytelling. It wouldn't make for a very interesting story if at the climax climax of every single event, the Justice League got called in. Writers kind of have to maintain this balance between, you know, the superhero fighting a villain on their own, winning against all odds, and coming out on top, while also providing an answer to the fans. And that's the question here. Why doesn't Aquaman call in the Justice League? Now again, this really kind of fits into the nature of like Atlantean pride. Atlanteans are like, we're the ones that know what we're doing. We don't need help from the surface world. We don't want those evil surface dwellers here. You know, we can handle our own problems. And so for Atlanteans, in a lot of ways, the Shaggy Man attacked Atlantis. Now it's an Atlantean threat. But with this scenario, the question of the top-ranking member of Aquaman's forces is call in the Justice League, man. Like, you're talking about a being that's almost unstoppable, that's got incredible strength. He's taken you for the ride of a lifetime. Call in the Justice League for help. And Aquaman's response is no. I'm not going to call this in. It's a matter of pride. It's really all this is. And pride comes before the fall. And that's why this is cool, is because Aquaman's not thinking rationally and he's not thinking reasonably here. Now, ultimately he does. He uses his Justice League card. He calls in the, Justice League satellite and basically has it teleport Shaggy Man outside of Earth, into space itself. Now, of course, this seems to indicate the idea that maybe he'll adapt and he'll be able to breathe and then eventually come back down, arrive or something along those lines. That we don't really know. But it is kind of cool because in response to this, we kind of get this question of, with him collapsing and sort of passing out, what does this mean for like the future of Aquaman with regards to the Justice League? If he refused to call them in a moment of dire need, is he standing apart from the Justice League? Does he not want to have anything to do with the team anymore? Is he effectively quitting? Because his card's out there now. His card's floating out there in space. And so he can't access the Watchtower anymore. I mean, there's no real key for him to be able to get in there. And so that's the question that this becomes is, what does it stand with regards to his character? But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. But if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.